I don't live in a very, very Jewish world. What I see as my role at the CJN, in part, is having this bigger picture of how society at large sees Jews and being kind of prepared to understand it. So on October 16th, 2023, I wrote a column really just asking, where would a Jew not be considered a settler? This was at a moment where Jews were being accused not only of being settlers anywhere in Israel, not specifically in the West Bank, and also anywhere in North America, and basically just looking at this question of where on earth is there a consensus that Jews can live and that that's fine. Sometimes the answer isn't a place, but it is rather that there are people who think Jews should not live. My name is Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, and I'm the opinion editor at the Canadian Jewish News. To support this kind of work, make a tax-deductible donation at thecjn.ca/donate.
That's what it sounded like Monday at the official memorial ceremony held in Poland at the site of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp to commemorate the liberation by Russian troops 80 years ago. This year, organizers broke with tradition, and they didn't allow any foreign politicians to speak during the ceremony. Instead, they chose to focus on the 50 remaining survivors who came, including 2 from Canada. The afternoon ceremony was held under a tent. The center aisle was right on top of the real train tracks of the entrance to the iconic brick Birkenau railway station, through which cattle cars carrying Holocaust victims arrived. The Nazis murdered 1 million Jews there, as well as other undesirables, including Roma, Sinti, and LGBTQ prisoners. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau joined the world leaders, including King Charles and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He silently placed a memorial candle on a table. Trudeau did speak publicly before and after the event, including during this one-on-one photo op with Poland's President Andrzej Duda.
It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be able to remember the Holocaust 80 years ago, the liberation of Auschwitz, and to know that it's not just about the past, it's about the present and the future as well. The responsibility to remember and to say never again continues.
Sir Prime Minister, dear Justin, thank you for coming. It's far away from Canada to Poland, but it's really important that you and the delegation of Canadians, you are here with us today, and you will celebrate with us this very, very important anniversary, maybe one of the last meetings with the survivors, because it's already 80 years.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Tuesday, January the 28th, 2025. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Justin Trudeau also sat down for a chat with 2 Canadian survivors of Auschwitz who accompanied him and the Canadian official delegation to Poland.
Well, I felt that I had to honor the people that had died there, that had no families.
89-year-old Miriam Ziegler of Toronto. She arrived in Auschwitz as an 8-year-old girl. She was sent right to the gas chambers, but the equipment malfunctioned that day, and she survived.
I'm afraid that it can happen again. It's scary. It's very scary what's happening now at the wall.
Meanwhile, 96-year-old Howard Chandler, also of Toronto, lost his parents, sister, and younger brother at Nazi death camps. He told Trudeau he's afraid of the antisemitism he sees now in the world after October 7th.
This is the thing that worries us. At my age, it doesn't matter what is happening to me, but we are worried about our children and the grandchildren. With the hate, it's unfathomable what is going on.
It's a time in the world where we need to be reminded of what never again means more than ever before, and hopefully this visit and the attention around the 80th of the liberation will resonate with people all around the world.
God willing.
I know it has been a lifetime of sharing stories, of making sure people understand, and it is so important that you've done this. I just feel so blessed to be able to sit with you and join with you here.
Canadian law student Pierre Poilievre of Aurora, Ontario, had a front row seat in Poland, well, pretty close to the front, close enough to be able to film Trudeau walking by and see the king and Ukraine's president. And even better, her seatmate was pro-Israel CNN commentator Van Jones, the black activist. Poilievre was born in Israel, but raised in Canada. She's 22. She's been an active campaigner on behalf of Jewish students and Israel on campus at Western University in London. And now this year, since she started at law school at the U of T. Poilievre has no direct Holocaust ties. She went to a Catholic high school where she was one of the few Jewish students, but she was eager to go to Poland with a youth delegation of the World Jewish Congress, where she's a Lauder Fellow. I caught up with her shortly after the ceremony ended. Okay, but so you weren't with the Prime Minister's delegation, the official one. You were on a different track to get there, but you were one of the Canadians that got to sit in the ceremony and do this. Why did you want to go to this? There must be more reason than just Hasbara or, your current anti-Semitism advocacy in university.
I think Holocaust memory is becoming legacy. And that's because of the sheer, passage of time. There's nothing we can do to sort of battle that. And I think the numbers really stood out to me. Someone told me that 5 years ago at the 75th commemoration of the liberation at Auschwitz, something like more than 100 survivors were able to attend this survivor dinner before. Yesterday at the same gala dinner, 17 were there. And of those 17, many were very, very young when the camp was liberated. And of course they remember much, but it's difficult, right?
Yes, I thought there were 50 that were coming altogether.
At the official ceremony, maybe, but at the pre-dinner, there were far fewer. And so as we move past this time where we have these primary sources available to us to connect with people in such a deeply personal way, we need to really shift the way we think about Holocaust remembrance and legacy and how we communicate these ideas. I think that as we lose primary sources, we need to take it upon ourselves to really act as these secondary sources who heard it firsthand and communicate these stories in an intensely personal way, because that's always been what really resonates with people most. You're not going to remember the one, class you had in the 6th grade when your teacher told you about how many Jews died at Auschwitz. What you're going to remember is when in the 10th grade, a Holocaust survivor visited and spoke to you in a small group about their story.
Tell us what stood out for you.
The number one thing was the focus on survivors and survivors solely. They really made the effort to, and I don't have a better way of saying this, but capitalize on their presence, really for what might be the last time, and highlight their stories above anything else. And that's why there were absolutely no political leaders giving speeches. And I think that was a really great choice. And in addition to that, I was really touched by the sheer number of world leaders who made it a point to come. So many other dignitaries, like it really was kings, presidents, prime ministers.
Describe what the setup was like.
Well, it's a tent really that they put up over the railway car that victims would be trained in on. And in the tent, right at the front, you had the podium and then this sort of theater-like gathering space around it for survivors and world leaders, heads of delegations, essentially. Then right behind that was regular seating, and I was right in the first portion of that seating. So
a really good vantage point. Yeah, lucky.
Yeah.
It's right in front of that symbolic entrance to Birkenau.
Yes.
Having it there, how does that sit with you? I know it's early, you still have to process it.
When we walked into the tent, we didn't believe it was real. I heard someone ask someone else, is that the real station? Because with a tent over it and with the lighting and with all the seating, it just didn't feel we couldn't believe it. And it felt kind of weird because we're sitting here in these like nice suits and with our water and with our nice shoes on. And 80 years ago, people were being, trained in with nothing but the clothes on their back that they would soon lose in the most horrific way possible. And so that really felt like something that we needed to acknowledge and sit with. So on the one hand, you're trying to reflect on this. On the other hand, King Charles is walking into the room. So it's sort of like it's a dual feeling, I suppose, right?
And have you ever been to Auschwitz before or any concentration?
No, it was my first time. It was really the most incredible first experience I could have possibly ever had. I went a few days ago. I made it a point to go with the regular tour group just to honestly see for my own knowledge how regular people experience this. And a few things stood out to me. First and foremost, I don't know if you ever visited, but there's a room inside one of the exhibits that just has human hair. And there was no warning when I walked into the room, and I just started sobbing. And my friend next to me was like, "Why are you crying?" And I had to explain to her that this is real hair. This is human remnants from the Holocaust. And it didn't even click with her at first because it's just so foreign to us, right? That something like this could still be around and still be viewable. And I know there's a lot of debate about whether or not that should be displayed, but I think it really hit me there, like where I am. And even though it was a very busy weekend and Monday was the official commemoration, and you'd think that the majority of visitors would be Jewish, I found that the majority of visitors were regular tourists who had no idea the commemoration would even be happening. So when they saw the tent, they were a little bit shocked that this really monumental thing that you think of when you think of Auschwitz was covered. But it felt really amazing to see that the majority of people visiting probably have no personal connection to the Holocaust, yet they still made it a point to do this on their vacation, essentially.
Did you have any chance to speak to any Canadian Holocaust survivors?
Not Canadian Holocaust survivors, but I did have the incredible opportunity to speak to a survivor who had survived Dr. Mengele's experiments. She and her twin survived, and she came and told us her story, and it was such a difficult experience for me. So I can imagine how difficult it was for her to share.
And did you get a chance to speak to anybody from the special envoys?
Yeah, I spoke to Deborah Lyons really briefly at the dinner, actually. We actually spoke about what it was like for me on campus. I think that was her number one concern, the second that she heard that I was a student. And I told her about what it's like at U of T right now. And I actually shared a message of hope, I think. I told her that I felt this year is far better than the year before. And I think it's due in large part because of efforts from her office with the handbook, just as an example, but also just the Jewish community's larger advocacy and the real emphasis that we're placing on holding people accountable. And I think that's really signaling to administrations that this sort of behavior where, hate is essentially pushed to the side will not be tolerated. And I think that they're taking notice.
So what about the Prime Minister? You saw him?
I actually saw him. He had a very, touching moment with a survivor. After he lit the candle on behalf of the Canadian delegation, he was walking back and he stopped to speak to a few different survivors, actually. And he took the time to really listen to them, I think. And they shared a really nice moment. And I saw one of the survivors mouth thank you to him. And I really thought, he should be the one thanking you.
You see the Prime Minister there. You see what's happening in Canada with all the anti-Semitism. Do you have any feelings about how the government and Trudeau's government has handled anti-Semitism at home and its positions on Israel that you would like to share?
I mean, I'm not thrilled if that's what you're asking. I think that I share the view of the majority of Canadians, where the way that the Liberal government has handled everything over the past 15 months is just completely unacceptable. And I think it's going to have lasting repercussions for them in the next election. The largest piece of inspiration I think I got from this conference was really, and this experience, was the constant mention of the lives lost and what could have been. We had survivors in our presence, and we learned about just the incredible families and lives that they've been able to live post-Holocaust. just generations and like dozens of people who have done such incredible things, all because they survived. But as they told us these stories, they always made sure to emphasize that because of hatred, millions of people never had the chance to live out those lives. They never fell in love, they never got married, and this was something that Ambassador Lauder pointed out in his speech. And we will never know what each of those lives would have done and what we lost. But what we do know is that hatred can lead to horror and can lead to this just the worst terror humanly possible. And hatred did lead to that 15 months ago. And we'll never know. We'll never know what the people who died, what they might have done with their lives. It taught me that all of us have a choice. You know, we can stay silent when we see these things happen, when we see hate against any community, really. Or we can choose to fight it loudly and proudly, not only for the people around me, but to really make sure that the people whose lives were lost and their legacy is maintained and their lives were not lost in vain, essentially.
So what else struck you?
I turned to my, right at one point, and Van Jones was sitting there. So I felt like
he's a CNN commentator, or was.
Yeah, I actually spoke to him last night. We talked about allyship amongst the Black and Jewish community and how important it's been historically, and his commitment to that. And it was really incredible to hear that we have someone like that in our corner, and that they acknowledge the lengths that especially Jewish Americans went to during the civil rights movement, and how he, at least, is so appreciative of that. Interestingly, every time a delegate would light a candle, it would stay quite quiet. And it stayed quiet all throughout when the survivors lit the candles, but when Zelensky went up to the stage, everyone clapped. And that left me feeling a little bit confused. It's interesting when you're in a situation like this where the focus really is supposed to be the survivors and the victims, yet you have these really high-level political figures who take the time to attend these things, and I do think it's their duty. But it's interesting, how do you balance the audience responding to those people versus really placing an emphasis on the victims?
I recently wrote a story about the editorial landscape of campus newspapers, how many student newspapers throughout the country are rejecting pro-Israel perspectives. It also focuses on what students are doing about it. This was an important story that I think highlights the cultural war that's taking place on campuses right now, as students continue to adopt an anti-Israel and, in some cases, anti-Jewish perspective. My career as a journalist actually started at a student newspaper years ago, so this was a full circle moment that's allowed me to revisit my roots and see how much has changed in a post-October 7th world. My name is Mitchell Konski. I cover campus life and education for the Canadian Jewish News. If you want to support this work and everything else that we do at the CJN, please visit thecjn.ca/donate. And if you're Canadian, you can also get a tax receipt.
Yeah.
88 is very significant, Prime Minister, because 88 means Heil Hitler.
While Trudeau was in Poland attending what might be one of his final international events before stepping down as Prime Minister in March, some critics back home wrote on social media that it was a disgrace to see him there, since his government hasn't managed to speak up forcefully enough to stop the virulent anti-Semitism against Canada's Jewish community. On this day, his team was indeed busy announcing millions in funding for Holocaust education initiatives, including $3.5 million in grants to be divided amongst Holocaust museums in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, and to Victoria's Jewish Federation, as well as to the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation and the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem. The rest of the money, about $1 million, will go to UNESCO, which is a United Nations agency that has a Holocaust and genocide program. While Poland insisted there would be no politicking at their high-profile event, the tone at ceremonies here in Canada was decidedly partisan.
For many in our community, it has been a time of fear.
At the Toronto Holocaust Museum, when Liberal MP Yara Sachs, a Minister of Addictions and Mental Health, gave details of some of that funding, she took a jab at the opposition Conservatives, blaming them for the likely demise of one of the Liberals' key policy promises these last few years, the new online harms bill, which the Tories oppose because they feel it impinges on freedom of speech on the internet. The bill was never passed despite multiple revisions and amendments, and now won't likely be either because Trudeau prorogued Parliament until late March while his party holds the leadership race. Here's Sachs being interviewed by our CJN's Lila Sarek.
Where is that in terms of we're talking about online hate, that bill seems to have been stuck for years now?
So Bill C-63 has not been stuck for years. Bill C-63 has been stuck in this session of Parliament because the Conservatives decided that their point of privilege was more important than addressing online harms and hate, which the bill unpacks. We know we have allies both in the Bloc and in the NDP to see the online harms legislation move forward. We know that Canadians are demanding it. You know that families and parents and educators know how important this legislation is to protect our young people. It's unfortunate that the Conservatives chose to play partisan politics in the House rather than moving forward on legislation that literally would keep our young Canadians safe. We are fully committed to getting that legislation through. You need partners at the table, and the Conservatives could learn a lot about what it means to be a partner to keep Canadians safe rather than playing partisan politics on ours. I think we have a collective responsibility to Canadians right now, especially with the new administration south of the border and the threat of tariffs, to stand up and fight for Canadians.
Good morning. Bonjour. Dzień dobry.
In Ottawa, at the Jewish community's national ceremony held at the Holocaust Monument just west of the Parliament buildings, opposition leader Pierre Poilievre repeated his support for the State of Israel and for Canada's Jewish community and slammed the government for its poor response to Jew hatred.
We had all hoped that we had left the ugly, authoritarian, socialist ideologies of fascism and communism behind. But they came roaring back. A seven-front war initiated by Tehran seeks to carry out a Holocaust-like attack on the Jewish people. October 7th was the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But in the period that followed, Israel has fought back. The regimes and the terrorist groups that sought to annihilate Israel have themselves been annihilated. Israel has friends, as do the Jewish people. Friends that will stand through thick and thin, through fire and water, not equivocating, not speaking out of both sides of our mouth. We must stand with the Jewish people and the State of Israel in their effort to preserve their existence and to live a peaceful, democratic life. And that should not be taken for granted. We see on our own streets antisemitism, guided by obscene, woke ideologies that have led to an explosion in hate crimes. Hate crimes were up over 100% in Canada before October 7th. Now they're up 251%, with Jews being the principal victims of those crimes. We must not just condemn these things, we must take action against them. We must deport from our country any temporary resident that is here on a permit or a visa that is carrying out violence or hate crimes on our soil.
We call for the return of all hostages and for those murdered by Hamas, like Canadian Judith Weinstein-Haggai, to have their remains returned. May their memories be for a blessing.
Montreal Liberal MP Rachel Bendayan, the new Minister of Official Languages and Associate Minister for Public Safety, surprisingly spoke first about the release of the Israeli hostages. Before she even turned to her domestic speech, she announced the date of a coming National Anti-Semitism Forum. It was supposed to be in February. It's now March 6, 3 days before her party chooses a new leader and the new prime minister. The forum will be focused on security for the Jewish community. She also celebrated one of her first victories against hate since joining cabinet, the canceling of a caliphate conference scheduled for earlier this month in Mississauga.
I am sure that it is not lost on you that I am a very very new minister, appointed at a very peculiar moment in politics for a very uncertain amount of time. It certainly isn't lost on me. Only days into my new role, I became aware of a conference to be held in Mississauga by Hizbut Tahrir, an organization I had never heard of before, but with a mandate I know all too well: the glorification of violence and the propagation of hate and anti-Semitism. Not in Canada, I said. Not knowing what, if anything, I could do, I began to hold meetings on the HUT and looking into the process of listing this and organizations like it. Not knowing what, if anything, would come of it, I wrote a letter condemning HUT in the strongest possible terms. A day after publishing that letter, 24 hours later, HUT announced that it was canceling their event. It was an important lesson for me, one that I promise you that I will not forget. The truth is, each and every single one of us has the power to effect positive change.
Our government must act now.
B'nai B'rith Canada's David Granovsky struggled to pull out a large poster board with a red line through a swastika at the event. Despite the wind whipping through the monument, he urged Canadians to join the human rights group's petition to get the government to ban displays of the swastika. He also urged the release of the names of 900 suspected Nazi war criminals who came to Canada after the war.
Further, it is critical that the government fulfill its responsibility to ensure transparency with respect to its with respect to the nation's Holocaust records. Canadians deserve to know the extent to which prior governments were complicit in the immigration of alleged Nazi war criminals to Canada following the Second World War. David Matas, senior honorary counsel for B'nai B'rith Canada, stated, "Only through public access to Canada's Holocaust archives can we learn the lessons from those archives. May the memories of the over 6 million victims of the Nazi persecution never be forgotten."
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Across Canada Monday night, ceremonies continued to take place, while dozens of public buildings were to be lit up in yellow lights, including BC Place and Niagara Falls, Montreal's Champlain Bridge, and the New Brunswick Legislature in Fredericton. Calgary composer Daniel Pelton released 3 jazz songs inspired by the story of the tattooist of Auschwitz and by the numbers on the prisoners' arms. He was able to record his new pieces using some of the famous violins of hope once owned by Jews murdered during the Holocaust. Go to the link in our show notes and have a listen. Our show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman, our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening.
My name is Michael Freeman. I am the director of the Canadian Jewish News Podcast Network. When we first started podcasting at the Canadian Jewish News, we had to use the boardroom, and there was this wall of huge hardcover tomes filled with back issues of the CJN print edition, the old weekly paper dating back to the 60s and 70s. And because our microphone setup was not what you would call professional, my co-host and I had to prop up our microphones on these giant books, these tomes. We were literally recording on top of history. Today, the CJN Podcast Network has around a dozen shows. We're at 2 million downloads all time. Like everything we produce at the CJN, our podcasts are totally free. There's no paywall. You can listen to everything for free forever. But we do rely on the community to keep us going. And you can help. Please visit thecjn.ca/donate to make a tax-deductible donation.